in this speech. First off, on why this intervention is quite likely to go poorly, and then secondly, on why this harms long-term outcomes for Haiti post-intervention. Rebuttal will be integrated throughout. Before I get onto that, there's just one thing that I want to address in setup, and that is what the comparative really looks like. I think the comparative is likely that the UN intervenes. The one reason we get as to why this isn't likely to happen is because they already have tried, but it hasn't really gone well, like the Kenya plan falling through. Obviously, that is only one example. I think they are likely to try again, especially as the situation is likely to worsen drastically. The other specific reasons as to why they are likely to intervene is first off because they have had past successes. That is to say, the UN has failed within certain countries. It uniquely has done quite well within the past from 2004 to 2017. So I think they are likely to be received quite well within this area. This is an area that they know, where they know success is quite likely as well. The other reason why the UN intervening is quite likely is I think it's important to note it is not in an area with intense interest from countries on the UN Security Council. That is to say, it's not an area like, for example, where like Russia or China have intense interest, even though shipping interests that the Affirmative team talks about of the US are not the largest interests. They do not have massive political affiliations, so that I think any country within the UN Security Council is highly unlikely to veto any proposal within that regard. I think the other comparative as well is I think we're likely to have, for example, the US using all of that capital to instead do things like donate that immense amount of money to do things like aid or otherwise other sorts of things. I think the other thing to note here is that other countries are highly unlikely to help Haiti in the case that the US does intervene. I think this is for a couple of different reasons. The first is I think it's highly likely that they do think that this problem is solved. There are lots of other issues going around within the global system. Obviously, those issues should then be prioritized. The second reason why is I don't think they want to get involved, especially when they know an actor as powerful and oftentimes as violent as the US is involved, and they don't want to hurt their own interests accidentally by stepping on the US's toes. But the final reason why is because once one actor, especially one as large and as publicly endowed as the US, gets involved, I think they recognize that there is no more positive press to be had within this area. Even if they do succeed, the US is likely to take credit for them, so there is no incentive to intervene within that regard. So, moving on to my first point, why is intervention likely to go quite poorly? I think a lot of this will be quite responsive to the Affirmative team's speech. The first reason why is because I think the Haitian people are quite unlikely to cooperate. A couple of reasons why. The first thing to note is that they are receiving significant benefits from gangs. That is to say, because Haiti is in a state of such intense failure, where the government is really unable to provide any sort of assistance to the public whatsoever, gangs run lots of things like welfare programs, so on and so forth. The reason why is because obviously if they occupy the capital, it is probably good to have the people on your side, so you won't go around killing them aimlessly. Don't understand what this calculus is. But the second reason why is because I think these gangs actually are quite numerous in number. And I think what this means is that you're likely to have family members that are within the gangs, your brothers or your fathers or your sons, so on and so forth. And I think this means that you're likely to, even if you don't care about the gang specifically, you do care about your family members' welfare, and so you look out for them in that sense. But the final reason why is just because of the US specifically. That is to say, I think a lot of people are incredibly distrustful of the US, considering their past history, and I do not think they are likely to be incredibly receptive towards them, especially when they know intervention is likely to escalate drastically. Okay, second reason why this is likely to go quite poorly is because the US is likely to use large amounts of force. I think the reason why is because cracking down on crime, especially when it is gang crime that involves things like guns, is incredibly hard, and I think getting rid of gangs completely, as First House seems to suggest, is an incredibly difficult thing. It requires killing lots of people, and a lot of these people are likely going to be caught up in the crossfire. The third reason why is I think a lot of this is also likely to take part under things like PMCs, for example. And I think the reason why the US is especially likely to use a PMC within this particular situation is because the global system is in such a state of chaos that I think they are unlikely to be able to dedicate much time to this specific thing. Obviously, it is better in the interest of the US to focus instead on things like conflicts within the South China Sea or even the Ukrainian conflict, which they have donated immense amounts of money to. Their success as a global actor and their fame as a global actor is far more reliant on their success in those larger conflicts than in this smaller one, which suggests that not only will violent PMCs be used, but also they are highly unlikely to regulate them in any significant sense. The third reason why is because fourth reason why is because this is likely to provoke greater conflict. I think the key thing to recognize here that gangs are likely to believe in their own chances of success, and they are likely to fight for it even if they do not believe in it, obviously because you do not want to lose this incredibly large thing like control over the capital that you have. But the reasons why they're likely to believe in their own success, and the reasons why conflict is likely to become prolonged even if they do not win out in the end, is because they do have things like a turf advantage. And the reason why this is important is because it doesn't look like things like, for example, having mountains or flat land as affirmative claims, but it's instead about knowing a lot of people within the community. It's instead about knowing that a lot of people within here are on your side. It's about knowing how local systems work and being able to work those sorts of things. The other reason as well is obviously they have immense amounts of power, they have immense amounts of artillery and control as well. The reason why this specific point is so incredibly important is because this does mean things like citizens dying in the crossfire. These are innocent people. Many of them, even if they would not live in the best conditions under like a no intervention world, are likely to just die outright and die in violent ways as well. The other thing to note as well there is obviously if this escalates into a state of conflict or like guerrilla warfare, obviously this means that the state systems are going to be destroyed. There is none of that idealistic sort of like democratic rebuilding that is going to happen as ACT describes. The final reason why intervention is likely to go quite poorly is because changes in government are likely to happen within the US in 2024 with the presidential election. Sorry. Trump is likely to pull out of any existing conflicts because conflicts are expensive and unpopular with US taxpayers. The final thing to note here is if things do go poorly, it is incredibly hard to hold the US specifically accountable, more so than any other actor. The reason why is you cannot take them to the ICC or things like war crimes, and note also this is even more true under the current global atmosphere, especially because a lot of countries want to keep the US happy and on their side to ensure that if anything goes quite poorly, they are likely to come to their aid. The comparative that we offer you instead is we just do deliver things like aid. Note that this is a far significant amount of aid because things like armed conflict are incredibly expensive and obviously you have a limited budget and you must trade some things off. But I think the other reason why this amount of aid is likely to increase on our side is because I think Haiti appears a more sympathetic and vulnerable actor. Compare that to the messaging that has to happen in order for the US to be able to justify their violent tactics used to fight gangs. You have to vilify Haitians, you have to tell them that they do need to die and that guns do need to be used. Obviously that means this is a far less sympathetic actor. You're likely to believe that even if you donate some money, all that money does go to gangs. Secondly then, why does this harm outcomes for Haiti in the long term? First thing here is I think there's generally reduced faith in the government from the Haitian people. They weren't able to resolve the conflict themselves, and this also directly hurt benefactors and members of the community as well. The second reason why is because the US is likely to have some control over the government in power in Haiti when they leave. And I think this is a reason why their democratic election isn't as democratic as it sounds. Obviously, if they have intense interests within this area, like trying to reduce illegal immigration, like trying to protect their shipping pathways, they are likely to put in proxy governments and things like that they have done in the past. And note that this is a significantly worse harm and they have significantly more control than compare that to, for example, if the CIA did their like 1960s style Latin American tactics. Obviously far, far, far worse. But I think the other thing as well is this is a long-term harm because when you're stuck in exploitative economic deals, you no longer are able to do things like take control of them again. You no longer can do things like rebuild your economic industries. Your people are permanently in a state of economic disenfranchisement. But the final thing to note, it's just incredibly hard to rebuild after intervention. Obviously far worse if you have to rely on the US for everything.
How are you finding that? Sorry, please.
War is hell. Conflict is hell. People die, people starve, the consequences and the side effects are everlasting and will leave a scar on a nation. It is a tragedy. The question of this debate then is not a comparative of a world where there is war and there is not war, but there is conflict on both sides. You must ask yourself who stops that violence quicker, who results in less deaths to innocent civilians in that conflict. And on those two grounds, side affirmative is definitely ahead in this debate. Because the alternative side negative props is a UN intervention that has already failed. It props donating money But donating money to who? Because there is no government, there is no infrastructure, there are no hospitals, no schools, no aid agencies. This is a side that recognises that the USA intervention might be bad, but does not prop a preferable solution, and that is why they will lose the debate. The first observation I'll make is one on the question of whether or not we should intervene. And we bring you a lot of material at First Affirmative as to why the situation is so dire that it justifies action that might otherwise be justified in other areas. And what do we hear in response? Shrieks of silence, Speaker, as to the tragedies that are currently occurring in this country, and they have no proper solution to fix that. Let's look then at the comparative they do prop and why it is insufficient. They tell us that the UN will be the one. Firstly, they'll try again. The problem here is that the UN is otherwise occupied at the moment by conflict happening in the Israel-Gaza region of the world, and is unlikely to be concerned with what's happening in Haiti because it is not a global power, and the people are, in the eyes of the UN, the global power is not as important as those in Israel. And that is obviously evil, but it is the reality. But secondly, Kenya was the last option. At the point at which you're turning to the Kenyan military to help fix up a country's disaster is because every other serious military in the world has said no. It's because every other backer will not commit to it. Kenya wasn't the first cut off the rank, it was the last option, and it failed as well. And I've suggested the reasons Kenya didn't want to get involved is the same reason why a number of other countries that also don't want to get involved. The UN will not do anything. The second thing is the response was to say that the UN's had success in the past, so we'll do it again. One, the past doesn't mean it's going to necessarily happen again in the future. There's not a proven link in today's debate. But secondly, the question is like when? What examples are we talking about? They could not list any. And the third response I'd make here is that 80% feel that would be involved, and that would be US Army anyway, which is a general UN peacekeeping force, at which point all their harms about the USA being involved are the same anyway, because just the USA like wearing a blue helmet instead of a red, white, and blue helmet, it doesn't actually change that much difference in terms of how people respond if you believe their case around people not liking Americans. The third, I think this is the alternative, is that others will help. Others won't help rather if the USA helps them to be involved in it. But who? Who is sending aid now? Who at the moment is helping people in Haiti? And the answer is that no one is helping them. So the presence and absence of the USA is not going to massively change the amount of additional help that is already being given. The types of help they want to get instead, presumably like money, aid, medicine, or all things the USA is bringing in anyway, with this part of the intervention we're propping, so I don't think that changes in the debate. The last thing they say there is we'd much rather the USA give aid. But it's a question, the concern they have with aid is at the end of Hoyeon's speech, that she notes that people in America won't like giving aid to what could be perceived as Haitian gangs under our model. But under their side, because the Haitian gang is the only person in charge and the only person they're giving aid to, they're the ones giving aid to Haitian gangs, right? So they don't actually change that messaging impact because there's literally no one else to give the aid to, and the only way to ensure the aid actually goes to people and is not taken by gang leaders is by boots on the ground to secure that aid. The comparative cannot stand. The second thing, because that actually is really crucial and important for the debate there, because even if you don't fully believe that we defeat their harms and whether or not we can be successful, and there are issues and there is conflict and there's civilians who die, it's a comparative question, right? We get less of that on our side, and basically what is the status quo? People dying, people starving, and there being no structure to that country. Let's then look at whether or not we can do it. Their first push about why we won't be successful inside Affirmative is this question of the Haitian people not supporting it. This is a clear trade-off here. I think it's very simple to make. Maybe people don't like the USA, but when their livelihood, when their lives, and their children's future are on the line, they're much likely to perceive, prioritize that immediate need than any previous concerns with the actions of the USA in the past, because they are now the ones coming in to put schools back, to put healthcare back, to stop their kids being killed or roped into gangs they don't want to be a part of. The second thing they say is the gangs are popular. I mean, firstly, they're not popular, they're just singular. They're just the only structure that's there in the country, and if you don't cooperate, you die. And that is not popularity, that is hostages. That is people who are stuck in a system they cannot opt out of because there is no alternative. At this point, then of course they're going to support it, but they're more likely to support an alternative when we give them that alternative, because the problem is maybe they get welfare, but welfare at the end of a gun is not important, is not the same in this debate. I also think the welfare is likely to be sufficient. I think it's just an assertion to say these gangs actually care enough about this to look after them beyond the point of just not having to actively rebel against them. Even if they do rebel against them, they just get shot and they die. And that is the problem we're seeing in Haiti today that they're not solving on their side. Second thing I say is the families involved. We're not going around and literally killing every gang member that we're a part of. We're taking apart the leadership of those gangs. We're taking apart the heads of those organizations, because these gangs are unlikely to have strong hierarchies. They're unlikely to be resilient like Al-Qaeda or like the Vietnamese people were. Once we cut off that organization heads, all those people who are pressed gang into service because they have no alternative and their families will be killed if they don't join the gang can now leave freely because there is no one to chase them down and no one to hunt them. The third thing here is the cities, the gangs are destroying the cities, right? They have openly destroyed hospitals and schools. There is no infrastructure, no livelihood left to participate in. So I think for those reasons, again, people aren't going to think the gangs are that popular. They then tell us here we'll have to, it's really hard to kill the gangs. I actually think it's really easy. The USA has the best drones in the world. It can target individuals in apartment blocks with no collateral damage. It can take out all of these gang heads, and it would actually be incredibly simple. We're not talking here about a religious jihad or any sort of like entrenched cultural value. We're talking here just about gangs. Big guys with guns. We have bigger guys with bigger guns. The third thing they say is we'll send in PMCs. The first thing I'd note here is that I think it's unlikely that, again, one is just an assertion that I like to put the PMCs in here. We think it's actually more likely that the PMCs are going to be sent to countries where the USA military can't be sent, so PMCs are way more likely to be operating in Ukraine or in the Middle East where you can't have a USA flag attached to you for geopolitical reasons than they are here where it's perfectly legitimate for the USA to be involved. But secondly, they also want to avoid the worst outcomes, so the only chance of success for all the reasons that Matt told you first, that why the USA has a vested interest in Haiti collapsing, so they're going to send in their worst guys, they're going to send in their fleet. But also, it's a very small military contribution they have to make here because of how small the islands and how like lacking in power the gangs are. So it actually is really easy to just send in a battalion or two, and even that many battalions, like tens of thousands of troops. Anyway, don't use that many troops, unless it's in a PMC instead. But then there'll be a drawn out conflict because local gangs have more knowledge and power. I would say one, we have more, like the satellites, the spy technology, etc., also give us a pretty high advantage in that power as well. All their mechanisms on friends and family supporting them are all contingent upon the gang members being friends with everyone in the community, which we've already proven they're not likely to be that way. We have better spy technology, we have the capacity to ensure they can't utilise that local power. Please don't get this debate confused with places like Vietnam or Iraq. We're not talking about countries like that in this debate. They then said the citizens are dying, well, the citizens are dying already, so even if some citizens die in the conflict of US intervention, it has to be compared to a situation where gangs are murdering them willy-nilly on the streets without consequence. We think that is far worse as well. The fourth claim they make is that there'll be a change in government in 2024, purely assertive. We think Biden will win, neutral claim now. We would also say that importantly there's a low cost to this intervention, which means it's actually going to be on the radar because very few troops going over, very few troops dying, if any troops dying, so no one's going to care about this conflict. But also it's massively in Republican interest to keep this involved for all the reasons that Matt tells you about illegal immigration, weapons trafficking, drug trafficking into the Florida border. This is the bread and butter for Republicans. Of course they're going to support acting tough in the interest of national security to prevent illegal immigrants into the country of the USA, which I think is going to be a massive change here. Lastly then, I would say, in the long term, I think even if there's a proxy government, that's still good because there is a government, and that government, if it's bribed by the USA, fine. If it's Haiti, if hospitals gets money, that has to be compared to no government. It has to be compared to gangs killing people on the streets. We want to stop the deaths, we want to stop the conflict. We're doing something they are not.
Thank the second affirmative, along with the second negative onto the stage. The point that somehow the US has this like amazing amount of money they're going to draw from the depths of is completely ridiculous, because obviously the US is currently supporting the exact same conflicts that they claim the UN is when they support heavily conflicts in Israel, but also are engaged in many a conflict as they claim overseas. So I think to that extent, it is actually better to pull that money from the UN as we tell you, because it is because if it was true that Kenya couldn't do it alone, at least in the case of the UN, we have an ability to go to multiple other countries, and maybe the UN can provide in other ways. Like it can be a part of a broader scale to provide aid to Haiti, or a part of a broader scale to help other countries do that thing. But the point where they're telling us that for some reason the US has all this amount of money and capital to be able to do so, and has been studying this incredibly small country of Haiti that's close to them so heavily over the years is completely ridiculous, and there wasn't, I don't that much stand at all. Okay, a couple of issues then. Firstly, all I can what it actually kind of looks like with humanitarian aid in the UN, and secondly, why the US is a bad actor and all the outcomes of that. Firstly, on what I can what it kind of looks like with the UN. I think the first claim they try to make to get rid of our ability to do anything in our world is that claim that UN can't act. A couple of reasons. They claim firstly on other conflicts. Obviously, as I've already proven that is true for the US, but I think it is further true because they have no ability to go to the UN. because the UN has the ability to go to like the 190 countries that are all within it and ask for parts within each of them, versus the US having to dedicate a large amount of their both military capital, financial capital, and aid to the singular country. I also think the US is likely to do it in not a very good way, because although they try to claim to you that Republicans and Democrats both want like security because it's like close to their border, and Republicans can like spin that as a way to help border security, I generally do not think that the American people care that much about this tiny country of Haiti over their own interests. And therefore, with an election coming up at the end of this year, it is the incentive of the Democrats and the Republicans to shift their ways into more actual ways to actually help American people. And therefore their aid is likely to be untargeted, it is likely to be loose, and likely to be not have this amazing amount of capital that they claim they do actually have. I also don't believe their stuff about how they've been studying Haiti, this country that they claim is so small and so tiny. I don't buy the fact that they've had this counterintelligence on this country that supposedly poses no threat to them for years upon years upon years. I don't understand why that is the case. They never really truly actually explain that to any extent. We also have this, it's also the claim in second that like the UN hasn't done this before. UN did this before between 2007 and 2014, with much success in Haiti. I'm pretty sure, I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure they did that between those years with much success, and therefore they could do it again. They already have the intelligence on these countries and understand the systems, and therefore they are likely to be able to do it again. Only also to the aid point here, and how like being able to send aid, they claim is contingent on you being able to send that through government or having infrastructure in the first place. I think that firstly, proxy governments are unlikely to have that infrastructure anyway. They're likely to be more unstable. The people are unlikely to want them for all of the reasons we tell you about why these people in Haiti probably have a significant amount of distrust in the US system. So maybe even if you set up these systems, Haitians are unlikely to use them in the first place because they have distrust in them, because they don't like the government. On the converse, maybe if you send this aid to gangs who already provide a lot of welfare to these people, and they probably trust to some extent, although they're trying to claim you don't, they are more likely to use them because the people that are running them are their friends, are their family, are people they understand, but also the systems will already serve in some way, I tell you at first, in healthcare, so therefore they can further those with some aid. That can probably also occur. I do not think it is contingent to have a proxy government to get that aid for all the reasons we just told you. So secondly then, on the second issue, about why the US is actually a bad actor and why our world, given that it can exist, will actually be better. First, I want to tell you about why the US is likely to have lots of backlash, because that is something they try to completely take out of this debate. I think that firstly, as we've already said, Haitians are so very unlikely to cooperate. And I think that unlikely to cooperate for a couple of reasons. Because firstly, as we already told you, that goes to no end, and as we already told you, there are benefits to these games that they currently give out to people who are under them, such as like the welfare, such as like the system and the support of the communities that they likely know people within or understand how they work. They are likely, although I don't think it is generally true, they are likely to not support the game they are part of, even if they are doing some killing to other groups of people. Well, then they're likely to still support that game that they are part of to some extent. I don't really know, but ultimately they're more likely to support that than the US government, who they probably know for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because the government, they've seen throughout other course of history and intervention, is likely to use PMCs and likely to use excessive force that isn't needed. So therefore they're likely to be actually scared of the American government that is coming in, but also further that proxy government they set up. Because by conclusion, if they are scared of the US intervention, they are also scared of the person that they put in charge that isn't actually voted in by them at that time. I also think though that kind of principle falls down at the point at which that you don't get support from Haitians in the first case, because obviously you need the support of the people if you're going to run a principle about why sovereignty is so great. I think at that point that you don't actually get support from the Haitians, as I've talked to you about, that principle falls down entirely. But also, the person asking for support in this debate that they claim to be good is the president they also say is really bad because he hasn't had elections for so long. So if he was the one asking for support, it is unclear then why that sovereignty point sovereignty point still stands. They then try to claim that because it's a life and death, they will therefore, because it's life and death, and they're seeing all these killings and stuff, they are therefore likely to join in the government ideas. But I think that at the point at which they have just seen entire parts of their community killed and destroyed, and I'll tell you why that actually happens, by VMCs, by the US government, they are unlikely to support any further institution they put in place. They're likely to be scared for their life and scared for what will occur in the future. Okay, so why is actually the US active bad, and why they're likely to actually do bad things? Because firstly, it is quite clear that the way that you silence gangs and the way that you kind of like try to from the US perspective, try to prevent this idea is by outward displays against violence. It is things like beheadings in front of millions of people that says, if you join a gang, if you're a part of a gang anymore, you will be killed as well. That is the way you stop gangs in this debate, because as both teams agree, people are so intrinsically a part of gangs in this society. So if that is true, that it is public displays of like killings or public displays of like against gangs, you are also probably scared for your life if at any point you're a part of it, but scared what the US government might further do even if they don't kill you at that point. You're likely then to have so much distrust in that, but also there's probably a really bad thing against the US to be doing those kinds of to be doing those kinds of things in the first place. I also think it is likely to be done quite forcefully, as we already tell you. The only kind of like counter to this is to say, well, like people are already being killed by gangs in the first place, so I guess it's like not as bad, and not as bad. I think the key thing to say here is that it is not like, I don't think it's just like as clear as to what point like innocent civilians are being killed by gangs on their side. I think it is likely to be high-end gang members who, I don't know, to some respect maybe like engage in this, and it's like okay if like they die more than civilians. But on our side, the American government is unclear and is like scared of who is a gang member and who is not. So therefore they're likely to do this in a lackadaisical way and to all types of people, even if they have only some association to it, to squash all efforts on those people practically opposed. Woo!
The problem, I'll go again. Sorry, my bad. The problem for this negative team is the inability to be comparative. Because the context we set out in Matthew is that currently people are dying, people are screaming for help. And they say either the UN will intervene, in which case we explain that the US is far superior. It has way more military force, way more military expertise, way more military equipment, so it's able to do things like reduce casualties, reduce the amount of civilians who are forced to die across whatever. Or, secondly, they support a policy of doing nothing, of allowing gangs who own 90% of the city's capital to continue their rampage, to continue silencing opposition, to continue the destruction of government, and to continue denying people their civil liberties. They cannot win this debate because they have not at any point been comparative. Third neg is way too late to do this debate properly. Two questions. Should you intervene? And secondly, will our intervention work? Because we begin by describing the deadly context of Haiti right now. The 90% of the capital is under the control of gangs. That the assassination of political leaders is common. Henry's predecessor was murdered. That people are crying out for help, which is why Kenya tried to intervene. And our subsequent claim is a modest one. It's just that the US has a moral obligation to intervene and to reduce suffering. How does this negative team respond? They attempt to co-opt this moral principle by saying that the UN will intervene too. And I just want to strategically note that I'll deal with UN intervention now, which has practical considerations and implications later on, but I'm just going to do it all at once within this principal argument. The UN will not intervene for a number of reasons. Firstly, because of a previous failed attempt, they'll give it another go, as if the UN isn't a democratic caucus where people must vote. It is incredibly hard to justify in an age of fiscal austerity, where countries do not have lots of money and are spending money in other conflicts, that they should have another go in a conflict where they've previously failed, with no adequate plan on how they'll be successful now. Because observe how unspecific this negative team is. They're like, we'll just go in with more peacekeepers. That is not a solution. But secondly, the UN does indeed have its hands full in other conflict. Jack goes, the US does too, which is so deeply uncomparative, because compare the number of peacekeepers and military infrastructure that the UN has, which is to say very little. They don't have a standing army. The number of peacekeepers they have is incredibly small, to the absolute might and size of the US. Like, yes, it is true that the US is supporting Ukraine and supporting Israel, but that does not mean that they have boots on the ground, which is the kind of personnel that we need in our world, the kind of infrastructure which isn't currently being utilized, but they can under our side. Finally though, my claim is that even if the UN intervenes, they will be far worse for a number of reasons. Firstly, they have no standing army. They have no kind of centralized authority. They don't have the equipment the US does, i.e. the biggest and most advanced military force in the world. Which means if you care about casualties, you should support the side which supports like the most targeted and accurate military equipment. Drone strikes which should literally go through windows and crazy shit like that, rather than the kind of outdated equipment that the UN has, which is often donated by militaries because it is like basically redundant and they don't want to use it anymore themselves. So, how should you weigh this principled argument? My observation is simply that this moral exists outside of practical considerations, because it is a profound moral good to resist evil and gang violence, even if you're not certain to succeed. And the obvious intuition here is that you have the obligation to protest an abusive government, even if you can't ensure that your protest does anything at all. People are crying out for help. You have the obligation to help them. That's what we do. Second question, will our intervention work? And the test for this negative team is an incredibly simple one. Do they save more lives than we do? All I'm going to prove is that they do not. Their first claim is people will oppose intervention because currently people support gangs because they run social services. 5 responses. Firstly, this is an assertion. I know Hoyeon knows it from out of it, but that's not knowledge that the OAV has. There's no way that the OAV knows that Haiti runs services for people. But even if they do, they abuse this example because the example is that gangs run hospitals and schools for people within their own gangs, for the obvious intuition that they want their children educated and they want their family members looked after. But there are millions of people within the city centres who aren't looked after because they refuse to engage in gangs, they refuse to join them, they refuse to participate, and so these people are left aside because the government cannot look after them. But secondly, they rely on a selection bias. Like, obviously there isn't a large amount of gang criticism right now, for the same reason that people in China don't criticize the CCP, they don't want to get killed, and their voices are censored. Like, it is insane to say that within a dictatorship of gangs, that, no, people love it because you can't hear any opposition. Yeah, it's because those people are either dead or they are too scared to speak. Thirdly though, let's interrogate the context that we live in, because 90% of the city is rife with crime and mass violence. There are no schools, are no government-run services, there are no pensions when people age and can no longer work. Compare these needs to the memories of imperial evils, which are surely legitimate, but people have a preference for prioritizing their immediate material outcomes. You care far more about putting food on the table for your child than you do about the scar of US imperialism. Please, for the love of God, be comparative. So, you should believe that people will be generally supportive of intervention. Their better claim is that getting rid of gangs will bring an enormous amount of death. Their first myth is the US will use PMCs. ... Why? Like, the intervention hasn't previously used PMCs, see Afghanistan or Vietnam. But secondly, and I think this is the most important, even if you use PMCs, I do not give a fuck. Firstly, because they are far more accountable. Haiti can take PMCs to court. You cannot do that for the US military necessarily. But also, PMCs are made up of specialized soldiers who are the most experts in their field, who are the most able to do things like reduce casualties because they're not trigger happy. So even if you use PMCs, why do I care? Like, these are often the most accountable organizations, the most skilled organizations, the most well-resourced organizations. That is not harm even if it does exist. So you should believe that whatever force the US uses, we will be fine. Jack says the US doesn't have any good intel, which is uncontemplative of the setup we give you at Matthew, which is that the US does. Firstly, because a huge amount of legal immigrants flurry into Florida, so you have an incentive to watch what's going on there. But secondly, that a huge amount of exports are lost because Haitian pirates shoot down like shipping vessels and things like that. So you have the incentive to know what is going on and what kind of gang violence exists. Their second claim is that it's hard to be successful because there's guerrilla warfare. Firstly, sure, maybe there's some guerrilla warfare, but compare military forces, the amount of infrastructure, soldiers, weapons that the US has. But secondly, why is it guerrilla warfare? Like, it is often in high-density urban areas. It's often just traditional gang violence, i.e. shootouts. It is so unclear to me, like, why necessarily there's guerrilla warfare that the US cannot possibly deal with. The best iteration of their claim is gangs will fight tooth and nail for control, therefore all citizens die, which is firstly, a non-argument for the reason that they support UN intervention, they support fighting gangs. Obviously, some degree of people dying in the crossfire is terrible, but it is inevitable if they want conflict to stop. But secondly, they misunderstand how this conflict will go. We're not carpet bombing Haiti's capital. We are doing things like very targeted drone strikes, which can take people out individually within buildings. Or it's like attacking very specific gang strongholds. It's obviously not true that gangs are just existing out in the open. And the very obvious intuition for that is that there is gang competition. You do not want to exist out in the public where you as a gang leader could be shot by a rival gang. You establish things like gang strongholds and like the gang centers. That is where you exist, which means it is way easier for the US to be able to flush you out. Their next claim is that intervention will be short-term because Trump will pull out. As Robert explains, no, they won't. It's a good issue for Republicans. Firstly, because illegal immigrants into Florida is bad, but also will Trump win? I don't know. Their next claim is democratization won't work. The US will put in a proxy government. Even if they do, why is this harmful? Because they assume a status quo where the government is operating perfectly, as if we're deposing a wonderful democratic leader who's doing the best for their people. That is not the status quo we live in. The president before the current one was assassinated, the current one refuses to step down. Even if the US does depose them, if the US is able to make sure that people don't die and not commit to this as a harm. But secondly, post-Afghanistan, the US doesn't put in their own leaders for the reason that they want to be able to pull out. They recognize that leading assets, i.e. continual intervention, is bad, so you want to make sure that they can democratize quickly for the reason that you can pull out and then save your money and you don't have a leading asset anymore. At the end of this debate, this clash is quite simple. Currently, people are dying at massive scale. Citizens are crying out for help. There are three issues. You either do nothing, you let people suffer, you let people die. You have US intervention, the best military in the world, people most able to save lives, or you have UN intervention, not nearly comparable as a military force, not nearly comparable in expertise. Proud to propose.
Three things in this speech. First off, on the long-term outcomes. Secondly, just responding to this idea that they should intervene. Obviously, false trade-off there because more people will die from this conflict. And final issue on the success of the intervention. I think it will be unsuccessful. So, first off, on the long-term issues. Their main claim here is regarding the election, and they suggest that the US will hold an election. I think this affirmative team just clearly forgets that this is a sports debate because they just assume without proving that the US will hold an intervention. Here is the reason why the US necessarily does not do this. I think the reason why is because it is in their interest to keep Ariel and Henry in power so they are able to get things like future trade deals, because you have a certain debt that has been incurred with this particular government, and thus you know that this person is likely to be on your side, you know that they asked for this intervention, you're likely to be able to ask for future deals to be made, and you're likely to be able to get all of those things as well. But the other thing to note as well quickly is obviously holding an election is not exclusive. In fact, I think it's even better done on our side where you actually have the UN, which is far more experienced in holding things like democratic elections within these sorts of countries. Note that a lot of the US interventions just have been a bunch of violence. They haven't held any elections, I really think, within like Afghanistan, or at least like any US like mediated ones. And I think the comparative as well, it's probably a lot better when it's conducted by people that have not bombed your buildings. I think you trust the UN probably a lot more than a like incredibly violent actor that has just intervened. So, secondly, on this idea, should they intervene or not? The first claim here is that it's bad in Haiti right now, so we have intervention, have an obligation to save lives, obviously contingent on them saving more lives. I think we clearly proved to you that more people will die. I think the other thing to note as well is I don't think this affirmative team actually meets their burden in terms of justifying why an armed intervention is necessary. Their principle then is completely useless because we can justify intervention in other sorts of senses and just deliver aid a lot more as well. Okay, second thing that they tell us is that Haiti generally is asking for it, that there is public outcry. Obviously, again, as we tell you at second, it is Henry that is making this claim. They are not a democratic representative whatsoever because they were not elected in. I do not think this is a good call. The final reason why is because nobody else will do it, because the EU is busy and the UN failed with Kenya, so on and so forth. Obviously, this applies to the US as well, and I think the other thing to note as well is that the US is within the UN as well, so perhaps they can act through this actor instead far better because we're able to keep them accountable within this regard. So, main claim that we hear then from third up is that the US is better than the UN, good to finally get a response. So, the main thing that they tell us here is that they have more military expertise so they can do things like reduce suffering. Obviously that expertise is just shit at the point at which they've just committed massive amounts of war crimes for like the past 20 years in every single intervention that they have been in. I do not think they've been focused in any way in terms of trying to reduce suffering in any way. I think this is far better done on our side where there are actually lots of more mechanisms where the UN, which is notable for being slow, for being incredibly bureaucratic, probably means that you can catch those sorts of things out and prevent them before they happen. Okay, they give us a number of reasons then why the UN won't intervene. The first thing that they say is that there has been a previous failed attempt. I think the key thing to note here is that they didn't even actually get to the point of going in. They were just talking about Kenya perhaps doing policing. It didn't quite fall through. They didn't even actually go in. So this means that this isn't a previous failure yet. But the other thing to note as well is in terms of this idea that there are so many other conflicts that they have their finger, like the finger on the pie, like lots of different pies. I think the key thing to note as well is that there are not very many conflicts that are specifically within the UN's purview that they specifically can act on. That is to say, the UN can't really intervene in Ukraine, Russia, because it's obviously far outside their scope. I think they're far instead focused on things like, for example, developing states in states of emergency. I think there are far limited scope, limited number of these, so I think they're likely to intervene. Okay, the other thing that they tell us is that the US has a comparatively larger military. I think this actually flies in the face of everything that they tell us. That is to say, they're able to justify the fact that perhaps the US people are going to be relatively okay with this because this isn't a massive strain on the passes. Obviously, that means that this is a relatively small conflict because this is a relatively small country. So I think it doesn't mean that like a massive military is needed in any regard. I think the focus instead should be focused on other things. So, finally then, on the success of this intervention. The main claims that they give us at first, and I think these are quite quickly dropped, is that the US knows the area, that it's a centralized area, and you have reduced chance of public retaliation. Again, being so comparative here, obviously all of these things are better for the UN because they previously have been within this country, because they have built a modicum of trust with the people, obviously far, far better. But the other thing as well is like, just quite quickly, I think their entire case depends on this idea that the US has drones. Obviously, like the comparative that we give you instead is like, perhaps they do have targeted drones, but obviously they have incredibly perverse incentives. Our incentives, our weapons of choice are not necessarily like beheadings, but like the reason why they do things like beheadings, which is to do things like intimidate gangs and kill them out entirely. So I think this means that even if they do have drones, they are likely to use them in quite brutal ways. Okay, so we tell you that this intervention is likely to be unsuccessful. What responses do we hear here? The first thing is to say that gangs are not popular, they are just singular. I think the key thing to note here, and what this affirmative team doesn't contend with, is the reason why the gangs rose up is because there previously was state failure. That is to say, if you believe the affirmative team's characterization that these gangs are relatively weak, then you cannot believe that they just overthrew the government miraculously. The government was failing, and that was the reason why there was room for those gangs to rise up. I think what we can support on our side instead then is because people are likely to be on the side of gangs, is we can support things like working with these gangs to try and repair these communities. You get to do things like take advantage of those community connections and those sorts of that sort of like good vibes going on there. Okay, second thing that we hear is that you only target those gang heads. The first thing to note again is I think there just are a lot of people within gangs because you are able to do things like gang protection, which is especially important if the gang holds a lot of power within your area. I think this is further reinforced by what we hear at Third Act in terms of this idea that you only gain access to hospitals and schools if you are within the gang. Obviously then somebody within your family probably should join the gang and work as like the busboy for like drugs and stuff like that. I think this is an incentive and the reason why people do join these gangs and then do receive benefits once they are within it. The second reason why is because they are unable to do this is because they don't have specialist knowledge within these sorts of areas. And the third reason why is because I think like even if like those gang heads like were like shot away, so on and so forth, I think more people would rise up. And I think the reason why isn't because reason why like people rise up within gangs and are likely to replace heads is not necessarily this whole ideological aspect that second half talks about, but I think it's instead because it is just incredibly profitable. People just like being in positions of power, and I think this is something that is especially good when you know that your gang is so powerful that it controls the entire area. But the fourth reason why they are unlikely to target gang heads is because doing things like targeting gang heads does not send a message. It does not convey that there are massive consequences, that the US military will go after your family, will go after your entire community. That is the reason why in previous interventions, they do things like, for example, putting heads on spikes or pikes and doing things like bombing public areas to send that message that they are powerful, that they are forced to be reckoned with, that you should give in immediately so they don't have to waste resources. Final reason that they give is because final response that they give is that voters are likely to put their money within this area because it is electorally popular. I think again, the key thing to note here is that there is a trade-off in terms of how many conflicts a voter can care about before they start caring about their cause instead. That is to say, I think the reason why they instead prioritize giving aid to things like Ukraine and Russia and are able to excuse these sorts of things compared to Haiti is because obviously there's a massive ideological aspect to that sort of conflict and this massive ideological push towards democracy. I think that same thing does not apply here. The other thing as well, obviously Haiti is not the biggest source of illegal immigration for the America, so I think this is far better on our side. Okay, in terms of delivering aid, they say at second that it more so looks like we're giving it to gangs. Obviously you can go in to deliver that aid, that is not armed intervention, that is just something that countries do. But the other thing that they tell us is that nobody else cares to do the aid. I just think this is untrue. For example, France especially really cares about their former colonies, are likely to deliver aid and are doing it presently. Woo!
Okay, thank you everyone. I guess that no one's here, but because I'm doing a silent round OA, but it was a very, very good debate. A couple of things I'm going to do in my oral adjudication. Firstly, I think there's one point of really important general feedback with this specific debate. and then I'm going to go into my core, and we're going to finally my justification. So on the first point of general feedback, and the only point of general feedback, I think there definitely needs to be a more exploring and more talking about what is maybe the time difference between the United Nations and the United States being and their capacity to intervene in a sort of temporal sort of idea, because presumably within this debate, a lot of the capacities for either country to intervene sort of remained relatively similar, in the sense that from my interpretation of the debate and for what was happened within the debate, I had no conceptualization of how long it necessarily took for the United States or for the United Nations to necessarily intervene. I believe that there's reasonably lots of justifications why one might be quicker, or why the US might be quicker than the United Nations. I just didn't get those justifications. I think that would have really helped conceptualize the debate, particularly given that this debate necessarily had a lot of overlap in military interventions between armed interventions between these two organizations. Okay, a couple of things. Onto my call, I gave this debate by a close but clear margin to the affirmative team over the negative team. The reason for that is, in this debate, I largely saw there was 3 issues, but I think one of them was much more important than the other one. I'll point that out. First issue was the United States should the United States intervene, and was the United States justified in intervening? Secondly, is that whether it is the United States better intervening than the United Nations. I think this is the most important clash. And lastly, will alternative systems of intervention work better than armed intervention within this debate? So let's talk about the first thing on whether should the United States intervene, or do they have a principal obligation to intervene. I think the affirmative comes out and talks about a lot of reasons why the United States necessarily should intervene in these things, because of the fact that the United States has sort of a widespread obligation to individuals that are in sort of areas of the world that do not have lots of access to basic amenities. They point out the stuff about famine, no healthcare, killings, no police force, etc., etc. There's also a principled idea that people generally themselves want suffering to stop, and there's no real internal mechanism to stop this, which means that there's not as much as a challenge of intervening on the sovereignty of an individual nation, because the sovereignty of that individual nation doesn't necessarily exist in the context of Haiti. Now, I'm largely inclined to believe that this is the case by the end of the debate. The problem here is that the negative team largely doesn't deal with the fact that whether it is legitimate for the United States to intervene, with the sole exception of challenging some very assertive comments about whether sovereignty necessarily exists or not, because of the fact that Henry is not a democratically elected individual. But I think in the instance of Haiti, they didn't really, I think given the examples that were given, the last person who was in charge was assassinated. It seemed like it was the next closest thing to being a democratic individual, in that it made sense that Henry was the next person in line. So it was unsure to why it was not very democratic. Sure, he might have not been elected, but on the chain of command, he's still there, right? It still falls within the realm of democratic policies, which then means is that my interpretation of this debate is that is the United States and the United Nation United Nation intervention principally that much different? Because as Af points out, the United Nations also sort of needs to intervene in this debate for any sort of change to happen. And I think the answer to that is no, because no one really gives a reason why the United Nations is more uniquely principally justified on intervention. I think the only sort of basis for those arguments by the negative team is that the United Nations maybe has previous experience within Haiti. I think that was relatively asserted by the negative team, because the AF also asserts that previous said intervention was relatively unsuccessful, so it was unsure why that intervention sets a more pressing principal precedents to intervene by the United Nations than the United States. So at the end of that, I'm inclined that both sort of entities, especially given how closely intertwined they were in this debate, i.e., the negative team co-opting sort of affirmative team United States military stuff into the United Nations, unclear the principal separation between these two entities are. Then we come on to the second clash, and probably the most important clash, is the United States better at intervening compared to the United Nations? What does the affirmative tell us in regards to this in their novel contribution? They tell us that the United States has an interest in doing this well and doing this in a good way because of the fact that they have really important, obviously because of the fact that they have historically problematic interventions. They also want to go out future-wise, they want to avoid those historic problems by doing it well. They have sort of also just in of itself a public press and image sort of motivation to be able to do those things well. They second tell us that intervention incentives, they have intervention incentives based on the fact that internally the United States has incentives about immigration and so forth. They tell us thirdly that there's a technological and better military capacity for the United States to intervene compared to any other country or any other organization in this debate, mainly being the United Nations. Okay. How does the affirmative negative respond to this? I think in regards to public relation issue, I think the negative basically does very minimal engagement with the exception of a single sort of line or single, couple of sentences saying that historically the United Nations maybe have done things badly, but I think relatively pointed out by the affirmative team, unsure why historical precedent meant that future precedent that the United States would do it badly in the future. On the second issue about internal incentives on immigration, I think the negative tries to mitigate this by saying that sort of separately, by saying that the United States cares about internal politics and because of elections, because of internal intervention, that internal sort of things that the United States care about by Democratic or Republicans, et cetera, it means that when the election happens, Donald Trump is going to win and Donald Trump is going to pull out because they don't want to this is seen as a wasted expenditure. I think affirmative team mitigates this relatively well, very well, by saying that, unsure why Donald Trump would become elected in the first place, by pointing out that immigration policy is pretty popular amongst across both benches within the American House and American political system. They both sort of want to reduce internal sort of illegal immigration from Latin America and that area of the region. I think although they didn't, I think they do enough to mitigate the harms of the US internal sort of political turmoil and election-based turmoil having a bad impact on this intervention policy. Thirdly, in regards to military and technological capacity, the negative responds in two ways. Firstly, they tell us that they don't necessarily need as much of that capacity because Haiti is necessarily small and the United Nations is necessarily enough. And secondly is that gangs will replace leaders anyway, and sort of, they don't really need the intervention, even if they could precision strike leaders. That's not very helpful in this debate. So firstly, in regards to the first thing, I think that is relatively well mitigated by third affirmative by saying, well, it doesn't, that sure, Haiti, the United Nations might have an equal amount of manpower, but the technological capacity that the United Nations has in regards to military intervention is substantially less than the United States with respects to, for example, targeting drones at specific individuals, at specific compounds, very precise sort of military intervention that is surgical and will not lead to lots of people, all-out war and lots of people losing their lives. Which then leads on to the second sort of line on response by the negative team, and which is the gang leaders will replace when the United States surgically eliminates them, because of the fact that people will always because of the fact that people would always want to be in that leadership position because it's incredibly economically lucrative. I think that was equally assertive compared to the affirmative mechanism of why gang leaders won't have new leaders, and is because there is no ideological dogma that these individuals necessarily subscribe to. So unsure of like whether gang leaders will actually go and be replaced or not replaced, which means that I'm like, I believe that despite of the outcome, the United States has much better capacity. And also, final thing is presumably, despite the outcome, the United Nations intervention is comparatively much worse because they do need to go and fight street to street, for example, which means that more civilians die. So unsure to like, surely when you logically play this out, like bombing the same building over and over again or precision striking over and over again is better than like active military campaigns through the city. The negative then pushes two primary harms. Firstly, on on like why US is not as good at intervening as the United Nations. Firstly, on US history. Secondly, on gang welfare. On the first thing on US history, sort of two distinct things. Firstly, that creates distrust, and secondly, that creates minimal cooperation. And secondly, on the gang welfare stuff, they say that gangs provide, extra welfare, etc., etc. The problem with both of these is that it's relatively uncomparative, given the fact that, given the fact that I think the affirmative team do quite well in pointing out that the reason, for example, for gang welfare to necessarily be sort of a good thing in this debate, or the reason why it's not a good thing, is because just because you have welfare doesn't really mean anything when that welfare is one, contingent on you actually being a part of the gang, and two, contingent on you not saying anything bad about the gang. Like, presumably the gang still, is just bad. People don't like the gang because they're providing welfare. Like, they like the gang because they have to like the gang, right? And secondly, on the historical issues, I think that this relatively doesn't really engage with the material that the affirmative brings about, public, why US incentives are likely to mean that they do this well. But in regards to the specific personal incentives, or I guess the specific personal paradigms that people might necessarily have within Haiti about the United States, but presumably on that respect of the United States intervention from an individual perspective of distrust from history, why that necessarily isn't that important and also mitigated by the affirmative team, is because of the fact that they state very clearly that given the dire situation that people of Haiti are necessarily in, and the fact that US imperialism is relatively distant, they probably care more about the immediate capacity to put food on the table or to have better healthcare or just some healthcare at all. Okay. Lastly, what does the negative say about specific harms about why the United States are bad on novel and sort of contribution? They tell us that the US necessarily does lots of war crimes, and the United Nations are much less likely to do those war crimes because of the fact that they are much more bureaucratic bodies. Firstly, just unsure to why the United States will do all these war crimes given the PR stuff that Affirmative ran. But secondly, in regards to the United Nations, unsure why they're more likely to stop war crimes, given that war crimes doesn't happen as a result of effective or not effective bureaucracy, but happens because of on the battlefield sort of things that happen that leads to people doing war crimes, unless the war crimes are specific orders given by individuals, in which case, yeah, but they make no sort of claims about which one is more likely, which way war crimes are more likely to happen. And the very last final point is the point about sort of comparative, is the stuff about alternative forms of benefit, as basically in the form of social aid. I don't think the negative team really impacts how social aid necessarily helps these people, especially given no legitimate governments in place. They sort of assert at third that they will work with governments, they'll work with these gang leaders to make things better, but presumably the pre-existing gang tensions are still there. Maybe that doesn't automatically lead to better benefits of people actually wanting these gangs as legitimate government. And I think, yeah, because of those reasons, I gave it to the affirmative.